So now we're going to hear from David Bloom, the Clarence James Gamble Professor of Economics and Demography, a Global Health and Population Program at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard University. David is going to present this morning his research on trends in Alzheimer's disease costs and the value of investing in Alzheimer's research and development. David, thank you for doing what you're doing, and thank you. We look forward to your comments on what the cost is of Alzheimer's around the world and the value of investing in interventions that will prevent this disease.
Thank you, George. And at the outset, let me also thank the Global CEO Initiative on Alzheimer's Disease, the World Economic Forum, and the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. I'd like to formally thank all three entities for the guidance and the support that they and also their members and followers have provided and continue to provide to help crystallize and advance many of the ideas that I hope to discuss during this session. And good day, everyone. Greetings from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share some thoughts on global prospects for realizing the promise of the UN's Decade of Healthy Aging, with heavy emphasis, of course, and as George indicated, on Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, or what I'll refer to as ADRDs for short. As I presume most of us already know, the UN has dedicated the present decade to foster healthy aging and to improve the lives of older people and their families and communities. This is a prominent and an admirable dedication. It reflects a normative commitment that the rights and dignity of older adults and the experience of aging require respect, attention, and investment. Unfortunately, though, fulfilling the promise of this UN declaration, its dedication, is impeded by a multiplicity of threats, one of the most formidable being ADRDs. The world has 55 million people currently living with known dementia, and that represents a major global health problem. Even more important, it's a global health problem that is, with high probability, projected to grow exponentially to truly colossal proportions in the coming decades, as ever larger numbers of people experience a relentless diminution of memory, cognition, and social skills, diminution that is progressively devastating to them, their families, their communities, and to the health systems in their countries and beyond. But ADRDs currently and prospectively pose more than just a health problem. The sectoral scope of the problem is significantly extended, and the scale is magnified by the linkages between population health and economic well-being. In particular, ADRDs represent a major economic problem. It's an economic problem that's poised to grow to potentially staggering proportions, and that will represent a significant barrier to economic progress and development. The health economics literature points to dementia costing the world $9+ trillion in 2050. I'll basically corroborate that figure as representing the portion of global GDP that will be foregone, or potential GDP that will be foregone, due to the ADRD-related reduction of own labor and income, due to a substantial diversion of caregiver labor from paid work, and due to reduced physical capital accumulation associated with costs of treatment and care. I'll also note that this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the full societal burden of ADRDs. Properly sizing the full burden would also require taking account of myriad other factors, like, for example, the shadow cost of extensive and intensive informal caretaking, the foregone value of productive non-market activities of people with ADRDs, and the burden of ADRD-caused comorbidities, including those due to non-adherence to drug protocols. Like many of you, I feel simultaneously distressed and mystified that a global health issue as daunting as ADRDs continues to fly so far below the world's radar for awareness and action with regard to modalities for prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and care. And I'm here to argue that improving our record with respect to these modalities is not a luxury whose enjoyment can be postponed. It's a necessity that requires global focus, cross-national collaboration, and transformational financing, with the wealthy industrial countries using their economic and political muscle to step up and pave the way. I'm going to focus heavily on ADRDs in this talk, but my remarks reflect more than just a special pleading for sharply increased attention to ADRDs. They also reflect a more general observation and related evidence pointing to significant undervaluation of population health in the world. I'll explain why, and I'll comment on the implications of that undervaluation for health budgets. Basically, the point being that they're set way too low. And I'm also going to complain about the fact that individual health interventions are commonly decided by patently ill-founded calculations insofar as they compare full intervention costs to but partial intervention benefits. So along these lines, there are three core building blocks for my remarks. The first is a line of basic research that many economists have been pursuing for nearly 25 years now on the proposition that healthier means wealthier. In other words, the notion that healthy populations grow their incomes faster than their less healthy counterparts. The second building block has to do with the conduct of health technology assessments, which generally fail to account for the full societal burdens of health limitations, thereby resulting in the undervaluation of health technology innovation and health technology access, and further leading to suboptimally low health budgets and to skewed health system priorities. And the third building block is some very specific research on the scale and scope of the health and economic challenges of ADRDs, and also on the global attention, collaboration, and financing that will be required to address those challenges. With regard to this last item, I'm especially pleased to call out the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, for publishing some of our work today in the online edition of their magazine, Finance and Development. If you go to their website, www.imf.org/FANDD for Finance and Development, you'll see shortly or later today an article that will also appear in the December print edition of the magazine entitled Dementia Storm on the Horizon. The article is actually an early product of a research team that I lead that's been hard at work for the past 12 months. The team consists of 11 highly skilled, creative, and motivated scholars encompassing a range of disciplines, including geriatrics, psychiatry, biology, public health, medicine, public policy, and economics. The central focus of that team's efforts has been on conceptualizing and quantifying the current and prospective health and economic burdens imposed by ADRDs. In doing that, we've tried to build on and compare our results to the good work already done by many others around the world, such as Anders Wimo and his colleagues at the WHO, such as Michael Hurd and Paco Martorell at the University of Southern California, and including also a research team led by Chris Murray and his colleagues at the Seattle-based Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. In addition to that work, on which I'll report a bit this morning or today, midway through my team's efforts, we added another goal to our project, namely to calculate optimal investment spending on research and development for ADRD interventions involving disease-modifying therapies. When our final report is launched, you will see that it has two specific and concrete sets of objectives. The first is to use the most recent data and the most appropriate and best economic tools available to measure and project out to the year 2050 the health and economic burdens of ADRDs. And the second is to explore selected options for minimizing the size of the coming global ADRD storm and cushioning its individual and societal impacts. So with that as background, let me turn now to laying out some of the conceptual and empirical foundations for our work on ADRDs. And to begin, and as I'm sure many of you know, healthier populations tend to have higher incomes than their less healthy counterparts. For decades, economists assumed this pattern reflected a causal link running from income to health. That makes sense. It makes sense because higher income naturally translates into better nutrition and better access to safe water, sanitation, quality healthcare, and psychosocial resources. But that's only part of the story. The other part, which has come to the fore much more recently, refers to the reverse causal link that's well summarized by the tagline, healthier means wealthier. This tagline reflects the fact that healthy populations have relatively greater potential for rapid and robust income growth and wealth accumulation. That also makes sense. It makes sense insofar as healthy populations are known to have higher labor participation, higher labor productivity, better education sector performance, and higher rates of savings and investment, both domestic and foreign. Healthy populations also tend to be more stable, cohesive, equitable, and secure, all of which is properly regarded as an additional source of benefit. Now, the observation that population health tends to advantage society in a multiplicity of ways is essentially a way of saying that health interventions do more than just reduce morbidity and mortality. They also have follow-on economic and social benefits that need to be acknowledged and appropriately valued. But the unfortunate reality here is that policymakers and health technology assessors throughout the world typically fail to recognize the value of such follow-on benefits. Much of what I'm saying would have been deemed speculative and perhaps been a bit controversial some years ago. But the experience of COVID-19 has taken out of academic circles and made self-evident to policymakers and people throughout the world the negative effects of health issues on everything from productivity and income to peace of mind and social and economic inequities. COVID-19 has provided incontrovertible evidence of the negative effects of health risks on income and schooling. In addition, by dramatically diminishing people's sense of safety and well-being, the pandemic has demonstrated the high cost of anxiety caused by health risks. And COVID-19 has greatly increased awareness of social and economic inequities in risks of infection, access to quality health care, and social injustice more generally. COVID-19 has revealed these truths throughout the world in line with the heavy health, economic, and social tolls exacted by the pandemic. And my point here is that the whole world now has a compelling, shared, and lived experience demonstrating the enormous social and economic value conferred and safeguarded by good health. In this way, the pandemic is strongly confirmatory of 2 decades of economic research pointing to health as not just a consequence, but also a cause of economic growth and development, and of health as both an indicator and also an instrument of human progress. So there are 2 overarching points I'm trying to make here. The first point is that sound economic reasoning and rapidly accumulating evidence from the economics literature, as well as the experience of the past 20 months, these point to indisputably high rates of return to income from improvements in population health. And the second point is that if you accept my contention that we've undervalued population health by neglecting or giving short shrift to its economic and social benefits, it stands to reason that we've also undervalued health interventions. Valuing health interventions correctly brings me to the second of the core building blocks I mentioned, health technology assessment and the way in which it's typically practiced throughout the world, including the current failure to account for the full societal burdens of health limitations. For those of you who aren't intimately familiar with the term, health technology assessment essentially refers to the systematic evaluation of health-promoting interventions, including treatments, prophylactics, diagnostics, medical devices, and policies. As a field, HTA, health technology assessment, is relatively new and rapidly evolving. With respect to HTA, I'm particularly interested in evaluations of the efficiency with which an intervention achieves desired health or non-health outcomes, including well-being and social equity. I'm interested because HTA, as currently practiced in much of the world, seems to be failing to guide societies rationally in terms of getting the most bang for their buck with respect to maximizing social well-being and achieving socially desirable levels of equity. Understanding and ultimately redressing this persistent failure requires examining 3 sets of issues that are fundamental to undertaking meaningful assessments of value. The first issue has to do with perspective, the second issue has to do with sources of value, and the third issue has to do with metrics. Perspective refers to the stakeholder or stakeholders whose interest we're using to assess value. For example, are we looking through the eyes of health technology developers, manufacturers, and distributors? Are we looking through the eyes of health ministers or finance ministers? Are we looking through the eyes of patients and their families? Through the eyes of employers, public and private donors? or are we looking through the eyes of society as a whole? Sources of value refer to the dominant interests associated with each perspective. For health technology manufacturers, value naturally includes the risk-adjusted surplus of revenue above cost. For health ministers, it includes population health and healthcare spending. For finance and planning ministers, it includes public revenues and expenditures and the distribution of economic well-being. And for individuals and their families, it includes the intrinsic and the instrumental values to them of better health. And then finally, for society as a whole, it would include most of the benefits I've already noted, net of the value associated with any opportunities foregone due to spending on a health technology. Beyond sources of value and perspective, we have metrics. That's what we use to measure value and set priorities among alternative uses of funds, and they need to have a clear and logical connection to the just mentioned elements of perspective and sources of value. For health technology manufacturers, a key metric is the commercial return on investment. For health ministers, a primary metric is incremental cost effectiveness. For finance ministers, metrics include fiscal balance and macroeconomic performance. And for society as a whole, a natural metric is the social benefit cost ratio that's reflective of a broad range of health, economic, and social benefits attributable to spending on health technology development and use. The practice that I'm trying to spotlight here as a failure has to do with the traditional adoption by policymakers, health technology assessors, and many academics to traditional adoption of a health payer perspective that has a dominant focus on a narrow swath of benefits associated with the protection and the promotion of good health. These narrow benefits include health gains measured in terms of indicators such as cases averted, hospitalizations averted, deaths averted, and QALYs and DALYs. In the case of preventive technologies like vaccines, some drug therapies, or clean water, the benefits also include avoided medical care costs. Now, the almost exclusive focus on these narrow benefits essentially means that policymakers typically have a blind spot when it comes to the flood of downstream value that health confers. In the present context, the blind spot hides benefits associated with elevated levels of adult labor force participation, hours worked, productivity, and earnings. And it also hides improvements in social equity that may result from the fact that the benefits of population-based health interventions often accrue disproportionately to poor people who live under crowded conditions, and also to disadvantaged racial and ethnic minorities and vulnerable groups like women, children, and the elderly, who may lack access to health care or distrust the health system. In the ADRD context, this last point is extremely important insofar as the center of gravity for the global health burden of ADRDs is shifting from high-income countries to low and middle-income countries. This shift mirrors a corresponding shift in the global distribution of aged populations, and it's most unfortunate insofar as it suggests an impulse in the direction of greater global inequality. Anyway, taken as a whole, the blind spot I'm talking about has been very consequential for population health. It's been consequential because undervaluation naturally translates into an inefficient allocation of social resources, which is basically a piece of economic jargon that loosely translates as bad decisions with respect to getting the most out of our social resources with respect to investments and spending on health technology development and delivery. If I can put it another way, by neglecting to focus on the full societal benefits of health, policymakers throughout the world have undervalued the health spending and innovation that promotes better health. This leaves countries relatively ill-prepared for everything from natural disasters and climate change to pandemic diseases and population aging, including the coming storm of dementia. A key element in remediating the issue of undervaluation and underinvestment is to do a better job of health technology assessment, which I can tell you is absolutely within our reach with routine tools and with data that are either currently available or easily collectible. At its core, this means adopting a broad societal perspective, which forces us to acknowledge squarely the fact that proper valuation of the health, economic, and social burdens of diseases is necessary for proper valuation of preventive, diagnostic, treatment, and surveillance interventions, as well as systemic reforms. So what I'm saying here is that public health programs typically involve public costs. What needs greater appreciation is the fact that public costs are most naturally and appropriately compared to public benefits. And I'm speaking here of full public benefits and not just a fraction of them. So the bottom line here is that it's high time we collectively face up to and remediate the fact that we've been using a defective HTA yardstick to guide decisions about public health programs, which is to our great misfortune and very much to our future peril. I'm going to switch gears now, and I'm going to turn to addressing the third and final element of my remarks, that being my team's research on the scale and scope of the health and economic challenges of ADRDs, and on the global attention, collaboration, and financing that will be required to address those challenges. But before I veer in that direction, I want to note that my ability to disclose results of my team's research is a bit limited by the need to avoid jeopardizing publication opportunities in journals that insist on exclusive results. So to that end, I'm going to devote my briefing to providing for you selected high-level results as opposed to precise findings whose release might foreclose certain publication options. To bring us back to where we started, the decade of healthy aging, I think we can all agree that the world has been supremely successful at adding years to life. What's less clear is whether we've been successful at adding life to years. Now, by way of a quick summary of our research report, I'm going to say a bit about 4 key sets of findings we highlight in that report. The first set of findings has to do with the health burden of ADRDs, which we show to be large and escalating in close conjunction with population aging. We also find, as I've already noted, that the health burden of ADRDs is shifting its center of gravity from the high income to the resource-constrained low and middle income countries. In other words, to countries that are the least prepared and in many cases wholly ill-prepared to defend themselves against the coming tidal wave of dementia cases. Just very briefly, ADRDs currently rank as the 6th largest contributor to global DALYs for people aged 55 and over. But by the year 2050, they're projected to overtake COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, to become the 5th greatest DALY contributor. And that corresponds to a tripling of DALYs associated with ADRDs between now and the year 2050. The second set of findings in our report relates to the current economic burden of ADRDs. Basically, what we do is we use the health burden as a crucial anchor for our economic analyses, and we find that ADRDs already impose sizable economic burdens. Now, this is already fairly well established in the literature. In monetary terms, the WHO estimates the current global economic cost of ADRDs to conservatively be $1.3 trillion, which I would note is a non-trivial fraction of global GDP, which is on the order of $84 trillion. Another prominent study in the literature from 2018 estimates that the annual global cost of dementia will approximately double every decade, surpassing $9 trillion by 2050. And that would put it at roughly a 5% tax on projected world GDP in 2050. Now, my team's report estimates an economic impact that is at least as large as both of those published estimates. And it's also, I would point out, conservative. It's conservative insofar as dementia is underdiagnosed and underreported. It's conservative insofar as we don't include the foregone productivity and non-market activities of people with ADRDs. And it's conservative insofar as it doesn't account for the impact of ADRDs on comorbidities or on the well-being of other family members. My team develops its estimates using 3 economic models. The first is Health Economist Standard Cost of Illness model. The second is a health augmented macroeconomic model, and the third is a value of statistical life model. We use multiple models because none of the standard approaches to economic valuation are ideal for our purposes. All three approaches we use have different properties and different data requirements that are only satisfied for a subset of countries. Because of this, that's basically the reason we use different models and take advantage of varied country-level data availability to build the best range of economic evaluations we can. I'm going to spare you, in the interest of time, the nitty-gritty details of the 3 models we apply and the formal comparison among them. But what I will do is move on to the third focus of our report, which is on constructing projections of the economic burden of ADRDs using these 3 models. And based on those models, the cost of illness model, the macroeconomic model, and the value of statistical life model, and based on sensitivity analyses involving each, we project out to 2050, and we come to the conclusion that the global economic burden of ADRDs will more than triple over the next 30 years. accounting for a tripling or more in the share of GDP that they represent. So the bottom line here is that when we peer into the economic crystal ball, we can see that ADRDs will soon be shaping up as a major source of headaches for finance ministers around the world. And I can tell you that spotlighting ADRDs as a source of splitting financial headaches is exactly what we've tried to do. And that was exactly our purpose in monetizing the health impacts of ADRDs. Monetizing the burden of ADRDs and the messages that monetization conveys have three great virtues. First, monetary estimates are useful because they draw the attention and speak the language of policymakers who are accountable for economic growth and poverty reduction. I'm thinking here of folks with the power of the purse, who often happen to be the same folks as those whose cooperation and proactive leadership will be absolutely essential to tackling the multiplicity and the large-scale nature of the challenges posed by ADRDs. The second virtue of adopting an economic approach is that it allows us to make decisively the point that the full societal burden of ADRDs is way larger than the health impacts and healthcare costs borne by those experiencing ADRDs. And the final virtue of adopting a broad economic perspective is that it protects us against the pitfalls of underinvestment in innovation and underspending on the provision of different interventions. And in that spirit, our fourth key research inquiry and corresponding set of findings involves building and calibrating a model of optimal spending on R&D for disease-modifying therapeutics focused on ADRDs. And the key finding here are results that show a dramatic increase in global R&D spending to be a highly rational and strongly economically defensible option for addressing and moderating the health, the economic, and the social burdens of ADRDs. I think it's interesting here to compare ADRDs and cancer. This is a comparison that reveals that cancer contributes 8 times as many DALYs as ADRDs, while cancer drug development involves over 50 times as many interventional clinical trials as ADRDs. Now that's somewhat understandable because the challenges facing ADRD research are considerable, with the disease not well understood due to the complexity of the central nervous system, and also because ADRDs have one of the highest failure rates in clinical R&D. However, a major finding of our report is that there is severe underinvestment in R&D for ADRDs because we've grossly underestimated the harm it causes. Along these lines, what's perhaps, as I say, the most innovative part of our report is a model we developed to calculate optimal investment in ADRD research and development. We modeled the investment in terms of 5 factors. First, the number of approaches to R&D involving ADRDs. Second, the probability of success among all projects funded under each approach. Third, the average cost of R&D projects under each approach. Fourth, the level of economic harm incurred in the population due to ADRDs. And finally, the reduction of harm expected from each successful project. Calibration of our model shows a decisive pattern of substantial global underinvestment, in large part due to underestimation of the economic harm wrought by ADRDs. What I'll do now is move to closure, and I'll do that by quickly summarizing the main messages that I've tried to convey in pursuit of the UN vision of future decades of healthy aging. Message 1, the health burden of ADRDs is already quite sizable in magnitude. It's also projected to grow rapidly, especially in low and middle income countries. Message 2, because of the interplay of health, economic, and social outcomes, ADRDs impose more than just a major health burden on the world. ADRDs also represent a major impediment to economic and social well-being and development. Message 3, accounting for the full array of health, economic, and social impacts of ADRDs in our health spending decisions is strictly necessary if we're going to make the best use of our public resources, both nationally and globally. And finally, message 4, the world must act decisively to deal with the dementia storm on our horizon. As a practical matter, acting decisively translates to a dramatic and well-justified scaling up of R&D spending on the development of disease-modifying therapies. I'd also note my expectation here that success in the treatment arena will reinforce incentives for the development of better diagnostics and more robust diagnosis-seeking behavior. And I would note as well that engaging in research more cooperatively and across more geographies and genetic profiles would also seem to offer the possibility of a giant step forward, with the wealthy industrial countries as the natural spark plug for an increasingly global effort. So my absolute bottom line then is that ADRDs must be addressed now, both as a matter of urgency and as a matter of sustained commitment. When it comes to health, the world has a demonstrated tendency to cycle through periods of neglect and panic. In other words, we neglect the issues when they are not immediately imperiling us, then we scramble like mad when they're in our face, only to go back into neglect mode when they ebb. That was, for example, our experience with SARS, Ebola, and most recently and prominently, COVID-19. And all I can say is shame on all of us if we repeat the experience with ADRDs. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Well, thank you, David, and for such a comprehensive and very well articulated plea for both greater attention and a greater and better perspective on how to address this issue. I'm really excited that this paper is available in the December issue of IMF Finance and Development magazine, now live online. That is the audience which should hear this message. This is the audience that should get it. And we obviously as a field will amplify your points and your messages that you've just so well articulated. We're going to upload the IMF article to the Attendify platform for all of you. We'll also send it around post-Lausanne to all the Lausanne registrants.